The keynote is called The Monetary Architecture Framework as a Toolkit for Critical Finance Research. Give a bit of an introduction to the whole thing, and then talk about the grammar of the monetary architecture framework, as I called it at some point, and then looking at the transatlantic and global monetary architectures, how I've conceptualized it in some past publications. Then we have been developing this online tool which shows transformation of the transatlantic monetary architecture in the global financial crisis and the Euro crisis. So I will show this. And then I will present this mapping of the German fiscal ecosystem that we've done, and then just like discuss a few more applications, and then also give the stage to Mark, Friederike, Andre, Verena, who are gonna like present like other things that we've done, like sort of with this framework. So, the OBFA-TRANSFORM project, so the full name for it is called The Political Economy of Financing Large-Scale Transformation Off-Balance Sheet Fiscal Agencies in War Reconstruction and the Green Transition. Monetary architecture is the conceptual framework we use in this group. We have developed 2 websites like in the course of this project. So it's a 6-year project. We're now halfway through. The first website is called OBFA-transform.eu, which sort of showcases the different publications that we've been working on. And the other one is called monetaryarchitecture.com, where we really have started uploading case studies of dynamic webs of interlocking balance sheets, but the whole thing is supposed to grow further. So it's built in a way that more case studies can be added. So it's like a living thing. And I'm also very curious, if you had the chance to look at it, what you think about it and how can it be improved. This monetary architecture framework has really accidental origins from my point of view. So I had a postdoc in 2019 to 2021. And I wrote the postdoc proposal, and I said, okay, I want to like investigate Europe's monetary architecture, which was somehow a metaphor, I guess. And at some point, when I actually got the grant, and so when you have a postdoc, you actually have a bit of time to sit down, and then you have your project proposal, and then you have to ask yourself, okay, what I'm now going to really do. And the idea I had that if we talk about monetary architecture, maybe it is possible to really use this idea of a web of interlocking balance sheets, or of web of balance sheets that interlock via credit instruments, and say, yeah, maybe this European monetary architecture can be depicted like this. And I thought that could be like a sort of a quick exercise. You could just draft a few balance sheets and show how they interconnect, how difficult can it be, and it just turned out quite difficult and sort of kept me going. Then the postdoc got extended because of COVID, so I had sort of more time. So all these mapping thingies also remind me of lockdowns when I was just shifting around things. And yeah, but so that's why, and because I was wondering, how can I do this mapping? So I always heard these web of interlocking balance sheet concept, but then how can you empiricize it? How can you apply it? And I think this is maybe also one of the core motivations for this workshop, that we all talk about it together. Just some thoughts about this whole idea of balance sheet methodology. So you can say this is something very dry, accounting oriented. But then I guess my approach was always more the monetary theory angle. During my PhD, I was interested in monetary theory and read like various monetary theorists. I mean, I worked my way through the Treatise of Money on Keynes, so that's Keynes 1930 here. I read Schumpeter, then Minsky, we already had it here, is an important reference point. During my PhD, I spent some time with Perry Merling, who is maybe one of the most prominent representatives of balance sheet methodology these days. But yeah, I found that it really traces back to Thornton, like in 1802. One label that also has appeared a couple of years ago, in particular thanks to Daniela Gabor and Adam Tooze, is this label critical macrofinance. What exactly these labels all mean can be discussed. I feel there's also people come up with their own label and sort of put it into the academic debate. So maybe monetary architecture is sort of the label that then accidentally got associated with me. In my PhD and then later in an article, I developed this thing that we call the matrix of monetary thought. And I think maybe this is quite helpful just to situate it. So there's there are these two big cleavages, that's sort of my takeaway from how monetary theories work. So there's the cleavage of the monetary theories of credit here and credit theories of money. So this is a distinction that comes from Schumpeter in his History of Economic Analysis. That's the Schumpeter 1954, who says, okay, there are these theories that say basically first you have something that is money and you build credit logically on top of it. And the other approach is to say, well, no, sort of somehow logically, so the question is it logically, is it historically? I guess it's more helpful to say logically, somehow logically credit precedes money. That means money is just a specific type of credit instrument. And what Schumpeter said is that most people, or like the dominant approach, are the monetary theories of credit, which are here, up here, but probably the correct ones are the credit theories of money, or correct in the sense that they're just more helpful to actually understand how the contemporary monetary system works. And another big cleavage was whether you so there's the state and the market, and whether you give priority to the state or if you give priority to the market. And there are traditions, so that was my thinking, that can be combined to both lineages. If you believe in a state-based monetary theory of credit, you think so first the state will single out money as a legal construct, and then you can build credit on top of it. Or if you, or the state creates some sort of fiat money, which is sort of at the top of the hierarchy, and then you can expand credit further downwards. And then the opposite rationale is sort of the market-based theory of money, where you say, okay, if you believe in the monetary theory of credit, you will probably think that money is some sort of commodity and you can build credit on top of that. Or, and this is basically what this whole monetary architecture framework does, is you say that sort of credit emerges endogenously, so it goes more bottom up, if we think in the monetary hierarchy. And then there are some instruments that we call money, others not. But so there's a spectrum of credit claims that form the monetary system. And then the question is, so how do we conceptualize the top of the hierarchy? So this seems to be this was like, after a couple of years, how I was able to make sense of it to myself. And then you see figures like this. So I guess this is inspired by how Perry Merling has showed it in his course, that you have sort of the money credit spectrum, and then you have a pyramid, which, so in terms of volume, the further you go down, the more of these instruments exist. And then you have instruments here mentioned on the left-hand side, so reserves, notes, bank deposits, money market fund shares, repos, which can be called shadow money, and then different institutions that create these instruments as the liabilities, so the central bank, the banking system, or the shadow banking system. And what I found interesting in this postdoc project was, can we now actually get from visualizations like this to actual balance sheet representations, which would make this more applied, or in a way empiricize it. And there's a book by Ari Arnon, which is called Monetary Theory and Policy from Human Smith to Excel. And he just, I don't know, like sort of accidentally had this figure in there, which was supposed to, so it's called a schematic structure of the banking system in mid-18th century in England. We see the Bank of England, you see London private banks, you see country banks. So that's basically the central bank, banks, shadow banks of the time. And you see how they interrelate. There's a hierarchy in there. And I thought, this is really cool and this is useful. So something like this must exist also for the contemporary system. And somehow it just wasn't there. And so Dirk Bessemer wrote an article where he said, yeah, so we talk about the accounting view, as he calls it, but so really drilling down on how you can put this together, how actually, yeah, the system around us, if we accept the view that it's a web of interlocking balance sheet, so how it looks, that's just not given. And so the goal of the workshop for the next 2 days is to show to you sort of the conceptual tools that we have developed in the context of the group. I guess there are three main ones. So these stock figures that are called that we call the monetary architecture figures. So monetary architecture framework creates some monetary architecture figures. So those are these huge maps that are somehow building plans. And then we have turned this into this online tool, which I'm going to show a bit during this presentation, but then also to explain the dynamics in the system and keep it a bit more manageable and like carve out clearer stories. We use these flow charts where we then just show sort of in a dynamic way, okay, if you want to do XYZ, how do the different institutions as balance sheets interact with each other following the rules of double entry bookkeeping. Sort of, I guess this is sort of the fun of the exercise, right? That there are certain rules of how double entry bookkeeping must work. So it has to be internally consistent. So every asset needs to have another liability. There's this benchmark of quadruple entry consistency that we're thinking about, right? So it doesn't work. It's not correct if it doesn't add up, sort of, and so you can like piece around until it fits. Yeah, and then I don't think so. To me, there's no real true way of doing it. I mean, I think that there are these. So quadruple entry consistency is already a good criterion for thinking about it if it makes sense what you do. But at the end of the day, it's always translating something that's out there that is just partly visible and observable into, yeah, a story that somehow is internally consistent. And I think that the point is always that you need to learn something from it, right? I guess what's also important is that it's not just la polar. So now we figured it all out, but also to make a step. So what is this for? And in the context of my work, so you have to make a lot of small decisions when you try to map these things. And at the end of the day, I think it helps most, what do you want to show, right? So because you have to make abstractions, you have to make simplifications, and yeah, so focus on what you actually want to find out. So it's still helpful to have a research question, have an idea what you want to answer, and then reduce complexity in a way that it's still conducive to that research question. Okay. That was the broad introductory remark. This postdoc that I mentioned, it was at Boston University, sort of escalated into this trilogy. So the first one was single author. The second one was authored with Fabian Pape and Tobias Pforr. And the third one was co-authored with Alex Gogie, Matteo Giordano, and Friederike was here. So the first one really was just sort of explains how the mapping worked, the invention of this grammar. Then the second, and showing what the postulating how we could think about the Eurozone architecture in relation to the US monetary architecture. The second one is about the international monetary architecture. And the third one is then about crisis-driven transformation again in Europe and the US. And I guess my personal research agenda was then to write spin-offs of this, right? Because they are just, so you map this, and this is sort of like these huge maps that are hard to digest. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of small stories incorporated in there. And I guess, yeah, what I've been doing since then is just like picking a story, trying to repackage it, sometimes include balance sheets, sometimes not. But sort of through this prism, through this view of the world, look at things like repos in Europe, the target system in Europe, international monetary hierarchy, monetary sovereignty, financial globalization, the special drawing rights system, and then also like in the project we have now, so financing transformation. Yeah. In this research project from which the monetary architecture framework emerged, the goal was to describe and explain the transformation of the Eurozone architecture. And I always I also cited in there, I remember having had a textbook about how the monetary system in the Eurozone works, and it used the Hume price specie flow mechanism. So pretending that we have sort of gold-like nuggets flowing around in Europe, and that this could explain how money in Europe works and how the Euro crisis worked. And I just found this very off-putting and frustrating. And when then thinking about how to reconceptualize what the European monetary architecture is, I had to make a couple of choices. And I mean, I pin it down on 4 main points, but this is sort of also emerged over a lot of years. So this web of interlocking balance sheet logic taken from Merling, from particular macrofinance, also the BIS stuff. So Borio and Distiatat wrote about this. And then this idea to say that that I don't think about European monetary integration bottom up like you usually did it. So we had like national monetary systems and then we united them. But to say that, so there's a global, so the web of interlocking balance sheets is in principle global. And the European states had already been integrated into like the global international monetary system. And so it's a changing modality of the integration in the global system, but it's not fully autonomous states now merging things. So, and if we think about the global system, then we are confronted with the role of the dollar. So it's an American-centric system. So the US is at the apex, whatever that means, and so so there's a lot of offshore dollar creation, which is what the BIS has been writing about for years. So autonomous money creation in dollars, but not in the US. And you have the shadow banking system, so these non-bank financial institutions, which are also not national, right? So they are globalized. So Europe played a certain role in it. The center was again in the US, but so there was a lot of like arbitrage around different monetary jurisdictions. And then the third point here, which has become a bit of maybe the most which I think was really new, was to think about the state, how to conceptualize the state in the global web of interlocking balance sheets. Because the typical way of dealing with the state is to say, well, there's the central bank and the treasury, so they are sort of the state. We have like monetary policy, fiscal policy. And when trying to map the Eurozone and like looking at what happened in the Euro crisis, there were all these things happening that sort of didn't really fit to this conception of the state. And I remember like trying to shift around tier accounts and making sense of this. And then, yeah, there were all these things that didn't really fit in. And I think at some point, this label off-balance sheet fiscal agencies came up. So it's sort of fiscal, but it's not on the treasury balance sheet. And yeah, then this category sort of emerged and also turned a bit into a research agenda, right, for Europe. And so to think that if we want to think about the state in the web of interlocking balance sheets, it really forms a fiscal ecosystem, and we can look at the fiscal ecosystem as it transforms, because it's just never static; it just changes all the time. And then the last thing when mapping these big monetary architecture figures was to have the criterion that it can only be true if it's closed, right? If every asset has at least one corresponding liability. And in that sense, it's a fully self-referential system. So that's the point of this market-based credit theory of money, that it's just self-referential. It's an open question. What is like, if there's outside money, what the outside money is. I'm not sure that the unambiguous definitive answer has ever come up. I'm also not sure I have it myself, but I think it somehow has to add up internally consistently. So that was also the attempt when mapping it. And then I came up with these 6 elements of the grammar. So first of all, to say if we think about states, we don't treat it in a territorial way, but in a legal way. So it's a monetary jurisdiction. That's also so that there was the story of the BIS to say we have to think about the end of triple coincidence. So yeah, we just define the US as a legal space. Then we come up with segments: central banking, commercial banking, non-bank financial institutions, and the fiscal ecosystem. In the fiscal ecosystem, you have treasuries and off-balance sheet fiscal agencies. And then we place balance sheets into it, and I called them institutions. And this is already where like the shit hits the fan, because it's easy to say the Fed is a single institution, but then there are a lot of banks. So do we take one bank? Do we take 2 banks? Do we try to map all banks? Then there's the whole shadow banking daisy chain. So there are rationalizations of how this works, but you always have to sort of aggregate, right? So you can no longer use like each individual balance sheet. So this is a choice that must be made, and it depends on the story you want to tell. And then you have to put instruments in there. And so instruments are assets and liabilities. Every asset needs a corresponding liability. There are a lot of instruments. You cannot place them all in there. So even there you have to sort of prioritize which one you pick. And then when it comes to who has which instrument. We maybe know this about the central bank because the central bank still publishes a lot of information, but when it comes to all sorts of arcane private institutions, you also don't know it, right? So then it becomes really detective work that you say, okay, I know so I read somewhere that they got this because of that, so they must have it as an asset. And that's a lot of piecing around until you sort of figure it out. But it's never fully complete. It's never all the instruments. So you have to focus on what you really think is important. And the other very idiosyncratic turn that this grammar took is to also include these contingent assets and liabilities. So it has these tier accounts with like top part and bottom part. Because, well, I was like socialized into it through the global financial crisis, and then there was always the too big to fail guarantee, which basically just meant, I mean, translated in the balance sheet methodology, oh, this bank thought it had a contingent guarantee from a hierarchically higher balance sheet to be bailed out in the crisis. So this is then really not accounting anymore. It's basically the opposite of accounting because it's an opinion, it's sort of speculative, but it's very important in order to understand the dynamics in the monetary architecture. Sometimes, in some cases, these contingent assets and liabilities are explicit. So there's an implicit, the discount window traditionally is the explicit liquidity backstop that the central bank gives to banks. But then very often they're implicit and they're even actively denied, but you can then still say, no, it has to be like this. So the idea was to sort of map this out. And then also the question is, how do you really put this into balance sheets? So at some point I made the decision, okay, so the hierarchically higher balance sheet that guarantees a hierarchically lower one has the guarantee as a contingent liability, because it's sort of, they have to pay something in case a crisis emerges, and the hierarchically lower one has it as a contingent asset. But also this could have been done differently. So this is just, you have to make choices. The next point, which I sometimes have made explicit, sometimes not so much, is the unit of account. This is really interesting if you look at cross-border interlinkages. So a basic classical story, what is the role of the dollar in Europe? Then you really have to think, does this instrument in Europe exist only in euro or also in dollar? And then usually when you look at official reporting, it's always converted into a currency. So you don't even know in which currency it's actually held, which just confuses it very much, and sort of is also sort of like digging and then often plausibility arguments just on the basis of figuring it out. I don't know, IMF publications, they convert everything in SDRs, so you'd never know what actually currency it is. So I mean, the idea is to focus really on the currencies because it's part of the story. So to which extent and how is the dollar held outside of the US and by whom? I usually drop the unit of account when it's just like an in-country analysis, because then it maybe doesn't matter for the story so much. And the last point is elasticity space, which was sort of a label that I found it helpful to use this for the whole Eurozone analysis. So to think about how much balance sheet expansion is possible, right? Because that can be an important part of the story. What the elasticity space actually is, if you can quantify it, this is really open to discussion. The way I define it is to say it has broadly to do with the willingness and ability of other balance sheets to act as a counterparty, to expand. The second is sort of all sorts of stipulations. So here the idea was to translate legal and political rulemaking into this balance sheet framework. And the third thing is the access to contingent and assets and liabilities, both explicit and implicit. So this is where the structure of the tier accounts really help to understand to which extent a balance sheet is like constrained or not. I then wrote these GEGI studies, so this trilogy, and the first one was really just about coming up with a map. And it was also finding the software to do this. I ended up using InDesign, then it was a mess. Then I had the designer who helped to place it. And it became really tedious because if you change just one line in one balance sheet, nothing adds up anymore. So then just one change requires a full day of work to like put it all together, as I said. So this was really lockdown activity for me, and has also partly traumatized me. So I'm then Friederike helped out, and she got traumatized. Well, the choice here was to like portray Europe and the US together, show the interlinkages, in particular how the dollar plays a role in Europe. And as I mentioned, so this, for my own research agenda, this led to a lot of article spin-offs. So an article with Andre about, so that was the first real spin-off I think we did, was about governing through OBFAs in Europe. So showing the logic of all these OBFAs mushrooming from the Euro crisis onwards, which is basically against the argument that there's no fiscal integration happening in Europe. There is, but just in the fiscal ecosystem with OBFAs and not on the treasury level. Then an article with Matteo about the target system, with Matteo and Alex about repos. And then still ongoing research with Thorsten Ehlers from the BIS about the dollar in Europe, where we've tried to use the BIS statistics to sort of also quantify a bit more what the Web of Interlocking balance sheets shows. So that's this figure. I thought I don't go too much into detail with this because it's not visible, but I mean, I guess probably you've come across it in some way. But yeah, so that was sort of the attempt to say, we have the US on the top, Europe down here. We have central banks, commercial banks, shadow banks, non-bank financial institutions, then the treasuries, and then like the setup of OBFAs, which in Europe are national, supranational. In a different version, we've also like included the subnational level. And then it shows here the kind of, so it has the units of account. So we try to show where's euro, where's dollar. The US only has dollar in most cases, except for, well, for instance, the central bank's foreign exchange reserves. But yeah, so this was like a year of work to come up with this. The second GEGI study was about the international monetary system. So this one looks like this, where you have the US and the apex, and then 3 layers of periphery. So first layer, second layer, third layer periphery. First layer periphery is the Eurozone and Japan as examples. Second layer is China and Russia. Third layer, Bangladesh and Senegal. And the idea here was to say that the US at the apex sort of can choose how other monetary jurisdictions get emergency dollar liquidity from the Fed. So Fed as the apex balance sheet. And so the first layer gets swap lines. The second layer gets the FIMA repo facility, or can use the FIMA repo facility, which was part of the COVID reaction. And the third layer only has sort of the fallback option, which is the SDR system, which doesn't even directly interact with the Fed, but with the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is a off-balance sheet fiscal agency here. And so this paper really also involved just figuring out how the SDR system works. So I wrote this with Fabian Papp and Tobias Pforr. We turned it into like an article in Competition and Change. We wrote an INET working paper about the SDR system. I had the paper with Jens van Klooster about rethinking monetary sovereignty, which is basically for me like a spin-off of this mapping exercise. And right now I'm working on a special issue project with Hermann Mark Schwartz on like he said to me, well, this just shows you as empire. And he convinced me that this is true, because sort of just this just the power of the apex to structure the periphery is just it's a form of an imperial mode of governance. So this is what we want to show. Yes. So now I wanted to briefly show the online tool. So that's the third GEGI study. I mean, I'm running out of time, and I also don't want to like dig too deeply into it. But the overall idea was to show transformation in a dynamic way, which means that sort of these balance sheet snapshots just show one idealized moment in time when this or that was there. But the actual really interesting thing is to show how this whole thing develops. And the approach was to then say, okay, is there a way to show change? And so that then really doesn't work anymore in a paper. And the idea, I think I worked on this for like really a couple of years also. try to fundraise for it, because what you would need is an online tool, basically a website that shows basically different snapshots at moments in time of this web of interlocking balance sheets, and depicts how it changes. And this always has to be in a sort of like a rationalized, idealized way. And at the end of the day, we built this website in the context of the OBFA-TRANSFORM project. So only when the grant, the Emmy Noether grant came in, there was the money to really develop this. And it so the methodology we have here is like a very simple. It's a simplification, but it basically says in crises you have 3 types of activities. So translating the crisis dynamic into balance sheet language. The first one is a contraction, which is here highlighted red. The second one is elasticity provision of elasticity that was inbuilt already. So bank balance sheet contracts, central bank gives emergency credit. The third is innovation, which is basically just a version of elasticity. So it's a new type of instrument or interconnection that wasn't there before, which had to happen in the crisis. And the vision for this paper and then the corresponding website was to basically have a narrative dimension. So maybe you can call it process tracing of how the crisis dynamic unfolded in a sort of logical way. It like plays around with time, because sometimes things happen on a large time scale. Sometimes they basically happen almost simultaneously, but you sort of have to have a one linear time dimension. And then show it visually using this color scheme. And this was really a year-long work. And we had to invent the methodology on the fly. So the online tool has a back end and a front end. This is a screenshot of an early back end version, where you see, the segment, the institution, the instrument, which instrument category it is. And then here you basically see moment 0, which is when start, and then snapshot 1, 2, 3. And so the idea is that for every step, there's one change. So this is this translation of the crisis dynamic into increments with Excel sheets. And then the whole thing is on this monetary architecture website, which I wanted to briefly show. So that's sort of the landing page, which is sort of oriented a bit in line with the GEGI study layout, and then you can get started here. And then here's the global financial crisis, here's the Euro crisis. But the way how this is supposed to be used, and it's not necessarily very user-friendly, is that you can, so you have here this time shift function. If I could only, okay. So these are T0, T1, T3. This is an explanation that we wrote, what happens there. So that's taken from the paper. And then you see down here, I mean, you can like hide this. You see here, you can use the arrows, basically how, well, contraction dynamics unfold, how contagion happens, then how inbuilt elasticity provision comes. And then the blue thing is actually what it wants to show, how transformation happens, because something innovative happens, and then new things pop up. Those can be new instruments, or then at the peak of the crisis, it's basically new OBFAs that pop up. So somebody told me recently, so I have the OBFA hammer, so I see OBFAs as nails everywhere. Maybe that's true, but yeah, I guess the big upshot is that many of the moments in the crisis, for instance at Lehman, was solved because you had some kind of new OBFAs structured in a specific way. And this is what we show here. Yeah, so this, I guess, has been the most, how do I come back to, it's just not my computer. To the presentation, yeah. So we did this. We had phases of the global financial crisis, and like based on this periodization, built this. Okay, very quickly, the last point so I mentioned that there are these OBFAs that popped up. This now jumps away from the GEGI study trilogy, and this is something we've done in the context of the OBFA-TRANSFORM research group. So for me and my own logic, that's a bit of a later stage thing, is thinking about what actually are OBFAs. And this is an article that we're about to publish. I mean, got accepted. It will be online, hopefully, in a couple of weeks. So this is, we then did because it was always a bit eclectic, ad hoc, what we defined as OBFA and what not. So because just you have the spectrum of money, so which credit claim is money, which not, and then also when you look at these balance sheets, which type of balance sheet that has some kind of public influence is now part of the state and which isn't. And so here we work together with Gregor Laudage, who is a lawyer who was very intrigued by the concept, but said that what we had written so far was really not convincing yet on a legal level, and he really wanted to help us refine the OBFA concept. And the result was yet another, but this time a bit different, huge figure. Which is sort of, so the paper is called State Finance Beyond the Core Budget, and I always suggest it should be read along the y-axis from here to the bottom to the top. So here at y=1, you have the core budgets. They together with, so it's Germany, right? Together with special funds and state-owned companies, they are part of the direct state administration. Then you have all sorts of entities that are part of the indirect state administration, so there's still public law. And then you have various private law entities that are fully owned or partly owned by entities here, up until entrusted legal entities, and then we even argue that sort of to some extent sort of registered religious communities are also part of this OBFA spectrum, and they have different revenue sources, so from full owned tax base to commercial revenue, which makes them independent, and they have different ways to issue debt. So either they issue no debt, or they can issue government securities, or they can be somehow guaranteed. And so this exercise, it took us a long time to basically develop the categorization scheme on the y-axis. But here we say that actually, so if we really take this categorization, we will find maybe just tens of thousands OBFAs in Germany. The reason being that basically we look at the municipal level, so municipalities have their own budgets, but then they can have state-owned enterprises, municipal enterprises for energy, housing, so they can be organized as private law entities, but at the end of the day, they also take over state functions. So this is beyond the capacity of what you can really map in this web of interlocking balance sheets, but this is really part of what we're doing in the OBFA-TRANSFORM project. That's why, to conclude, so from this idea of the monetary architecture framework of providing these maps, there's the OBFA-TRANSFORM project, which looks at war finance, reconstruction finance, and decarbonization finance using this framework. So the idea is we take the monetary architecture of a particular moment in time, today or in the past. We look at what OBFAs were there, and we try to reconstruct how the particular financing challenge has been met. And the other sort of spin-off, and I'm very excited that also Mark Swilling is here, was like a project for the National Planning Commission of South Africa, where we look at transformation finance in South Africa. We have compiled 4 snapshots of the South African monetary architecture from the apartheid era until today, where we look at to which extent on the balance sheet level apartheid structures maybe still continue to exist and have not been changed in '94 when apartheid ended. And yeah, so the big topic for Mark always is how to finance the just and sustainable transition, which is the big challenge for South Africa. And so the idea there is that it also must involve somehow using the South African monetary architecture, but this will be like the subject of the next session. And here I stop. Thank you.